Chase Hawk stared at the single-dollar bill in his calloused hand, knowing it was all that stood between him and losing everything. The mare before him looked half dead, her ribs showing through a dull coat, but something in her dark eyes seemed to whisper of secrets buried deeper than any man's grave. The auction yard buzzed with the harsh laughter of prosperous ranchers, their boots polished and their wallets thick. Chase stood apart from them, his worn hat pulled low, watching as prime horses sold for more money than he'd see in a year. His small ranch was 3 weeks away from foreclosure, his cattle barely surviving on dried grass, and winter was approaching like a predator circling wounded prey. Malachi Brooks, a weathered horse trader with silver hair and eyes like winter storms, led the limping mare into the center ring. The crowd barely glanced at her, already turning their attention to the next lot. This animal was clearly the dregs of the sale, a creature past her prime and heading for the glue factory. $1, Chase heard himself say, his voice cutting through the murmur of dismissive conversation. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. Sold to the gentleman in the back. As Chase approached to claim his purchase, Malachi Brooks studied him with those penetrating eyes. The old trader's weathered face creased into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held the weight of unspoken knowledge. "She's got more miles left in her than most folks think," Malachi said quietly, handing over the frayed lead rope. "Sometimes the most broken-looking things carry the greatest treasures." Chase nodded, uncertain what the cryptic words meant but too proud to ask. He led the mare toward his battered wagon, feeling the weight of curious stares and barely concealed pity from the other ranchers. They saw a desperate man making a foolish purchase with his last dollar. But as Chase helped the mare into his trailer, she turned her head and looked directly at him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. For a moment, he felt as though she was trying to tell him something urgent, something that could change everything. The drive back to his failing ranch stretched ahead, and Chase couldn't shake the feeling that this $1 purchase would either save him or be the final nail in his coffin. What he didn't know was that the mare called Temperance was about to lead him toward a discovery that would make his investment the most valuable dollar ever spent in the territory. The ranch looked even more desolate when Chase returned with Temperance in tow. Broken fence posts leaned at awkward angles like the bones of some long-dead creature, and the barn door hung on rusted hinges that screamed with every gust of wind. His few remaining cattle clustered near the dried-up water trough, their hollow eyes reflecting the same desperation Chase felt gnawing at his chest. He led Temperance into the barn, surprised when she walked with sudden purpose toward a specific stall in the far corner. The mare moved with renewed energy, her earlier exhaustion seeming to evaporate as she sniffed the air and pawed at the ground with growing agitation. Chase secured her with feed and water, then sat on an overturned bucket to study his purchase in the dim light filtering through the barn's cracked walls. The bank notice crumpled in his shirt pocket felt heavier than a stone, reminding him that he had exactly 17 days to produce 3 months' worth of mortgage payments or lose the land his father had died working. Temperance refused the hay he offered, instead pressing her nose against the wooden planks of her stall and whinnying with an urgency that raised the hair on Chase's neck. She was focused on something beyond the wall, something he couldn't see or understand. "What's got you so worked up, girl?" Chase asked. Approaching cautiously, the mare's ears pricked forward, and she began pawing at a loose floorboard near the back corner of the stall. Her behavior was so deliberate, so insistent, that Chase found himself kneeling down to examine what had captured her attention. The board was indeed loose, warped with age and slightly raised compared to the others. Chase pried it up with his pocket knife, expecting to find nothing more than dirt and maybe a mouse nest. Instead, his fingers touched something hard and metallic, buried in the earth below. His heart began to race as he dug deeper, the object feeling substantial and deliberately placed. Temperance watched him with those intelligent dark eyes, as though she'd been waiting years for someone to uncover whatever lay hidden beneath her stall. Chase's fingers closed around what felt like a small metal box, corroded with age but still intact. As he lifted it from its earthen hiding place, he realized that Malachi Brooks' cryptic words about broken things carrying treasures might have been more than just the rambling of an old horse trader. But as Chase wiped the dirt from the mysterious container, he heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching his ranch at a gallop. Someone was coming fast, and in this isolated part of the territory, urgent visitors rarely brought good news. Chase quickly shoved the metal box into his jacket and stepped out of the barn, just as 3 riders thundered into his yard. The lead horseman was Sheriff Dalton Keene, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. But the two men flanking him weren't wearing any official insignia. Their hard faces and cold eyes spoke of violence as a profession rather than justice as a calling. "Chase Hawk," the sheriff called out, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "We need to have ourselves a conversation." Chase's throat tightened as he recognized the sheriff's tone. This wasn't a social visit, and the weight of the hidden box against his ribs suddenly felt like evidence of a crime he hadn't yet committed. "Sheriff Keene," Chase replied, keeping his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "What brings you all the way out here?" The two strangers remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons. The taller one had a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, while his companion kept spitting tobacco juice into the dust with mechanical precision. "Had an interesting visitor in town today," Sheriff Keene said, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "Malachi Brooks came by my office with some mighty curious questions about you and that mare you bought at auction." Chase felt the blood drain from his face, but forced himself to maintain eye contact. "Don't see how buying a horse concerns the law, Sheriff." The scarred stranger leaned forward in his saddle, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who'd swallowed too much desert dust. "That particular horse has been missing from our employer's collection for quite some time. Seems she wandered off from a very important man's stable." "I bought her fair and square at public auction," Chase protested. But even as the words left his mouth, he realized how naive they sounded. Important men in this territory didn't lose horses to public auctions unless someone wanted them to. Sheriff Keene's expression hardened. "The thing is, Chase, that mare belongs to someone who doesn't take kindly to having his property redistributed without his explicit permission. Now we can handle this easy or we can handle this hard." Temperance chose that moment to whinny loudly from inside the barn, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. The scarred man's head snapped toward the noise, and Chase saw something flicker in his eyes that looked disturbingly like recognition. "That's her," the tobacco-spitting rider said quietly. "That's definitely the mare." Chase realized he was trapped between forces he didn't understand, holding a mysterious box that might contain answers or might seal his fate. The mare that had cost him his last dollar was apparently worth far more than he'd imagined, and powerful men were willing to ride hard and far to reclaim her. But why had Malachi Brooks sold her at auction if she belonged to someone else? And what was Temperance trying to show him in that stall before these men arrived? The sheriff's hand moved closer to his weapon, and Chase knew his next words would determine whether he lived to find out the truth. "Now hold on a minute," Chase said, raising his hand slowly but keeping his voice firm. "If this mare belongs to someone else, then Malachi Brooks sold me stolen property. That makes me a victim, not a criminal." The scarred rider's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Malachi Brooks has been dead for 3 days. Friend, found him face down in Salt Creek with a bullet in his back." Chase felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The old horse trader who'd sold him Temperance just hours ago was dead, killed before the auction had even taken place. The implications crashed over him like a rock slide, and suddenly the mysterious box hidden in his jacket felt like a death warrant. "That's impossible," Chase stammered. "I bought the mare from him today at the auction yard." Sheriff Keene exchanged a meaningful glance with the two riders. "Auction yard's been closed for a week, Chase. Old Henderson died of fever, and his widow sold off the livestock to traveling dealers. No official auctions happening anywhere in the territory." The ground seemed to be disappearing beneath Chase's boots. Everything he thought he knew about the last few hours was crumbling like a house built on sand. If Malachi Brooks was dead and there was no auction, then who had sold him the mare? And why was he standing here with what felt like stolen property and a buried box that someone had clearly died to protect? Temperance's urgent whinnying grew louder from the barn, and the scarred man swung down from his horse with predatory grace. "Let's just collect what we came for and be done with this charade." "Wait," Chase said desperately, his mind racing to piece together a puzzle with too many missing pieces. "If Brooks is dead, then who did I give my dollar to?" The tobacco-spitting rider finally spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Someone who wanted you to find what that mare's been guarding. Someone who figured a desperate rancher would dig where others might not think to look." Chase's hand instinctively pressed against the box hidden in his jacket. These men knew about more than just a missing horse. They knew about whatever was buried in Temperance's stall, and they'd come prepared to collect it along with the mare. "Here's what's going to happen," Sheriff Keene said, his voice taking on the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're going to hand over anything you found in that barn, and we're going to take the mare back to her rightful owner. Then you're going to forget this whole day ever happened. But as the scarred man approached the barn door, Temperance's behavior became increasingly agitated. Her whinnying turned to screaming, and the sound of splintering wood suggested she was kicking at her stall with desperate fury. Chase realized that whatever was in the box he carried, it was worth killing for. Malachi Brooks had died for it, and now these men were prepared to ensure that Chase joined him rather than risk the secret getting out. The only question was whether Chase was clever enough to survive long enough to discover what was worth dying for. The scarred man had barely reached the barn door when Temperance's frantic kicking sent a wooden beam crashing to the ground. The sound startled all three horses, and in the confusion that followed, Chase saw his only chance for survival. He dove behind his water trough just as the tobacco-spitting rider drew his weapon. The bullet splintered the wood inches from Chase's head, sending splinters flying like angry wasps. Sheriff Keene was shouting orders, but his words were lost in the chaos of spooked horses and Temperance's continued screaming from inside the barn. Chase rolled toward his house, the metal box digging painfully into his ribs. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and he felt the heat of the bullet as it whined past his ear. His own rifle was mounted above the fireplace inside, but the distance between the water trough and his front door might as well have been a mile. "Stop running, Hawk!" Sheriff Keene bellowed. "You're only making this harder on yourself." But Chase had already realized that cooperation meant death. These men hadn't come to arrest him or reclaim stolen property. They'd come to silence the only witness to whatever conspiracy had killed Malachi Brooks and hidden treasure in his barn. The scarred man appeared around the corner of the barn, leading a now docile Temperance by her halter. The mare's earlier agitation had mysteriously vanished, and she followed him with the resigned gait of an animal that had played her part and accepted her fate. "Found what we were looking for," the scarred man called to his companions, holding up a second metal box that was identical to the one Chase carried. "Someone beat us to it, though. The hiding spot's been disturbed recently." Chase's blood turned to ice water. There were two boxes, and these men knew exactly where both of them were supposed to be hidden. The elaborate charade with the fake auction and the mysterious horse trader had been designed to get him to dig up one box while they collected the other. "That means Hawk's got the other one," the tobacco-spitting rider said, methodically reloading his weapon. "Question is, does he know what's in it?" Sheriff Keene approached Chase's position with his gun drawn but not aimed. "Chase, listen to me carefully. What you've stumbled into is bigger than one failing ranch or one desperate rancher. There are powerful men in this territory who've invested considerable resources in keeping certain information buried." Chase pressed himself against the foundation of his house, his mind racing. Whatever was in the boxes was valuable enough to justify murder, elaborate deception, and the corruption of a sheriff. But it was also something that powerful men feared becoming public knowledge. "You have one chance to walk away from this alive," Sheriff Keene continued, his voice carrying false reasonableness. "Hand over what you found, and we'll let you disappear into the next territory. Try to be a hero and you'll end up like Malachi Brooks." But as Chase weighed his options, he noticed something that made his heart race with desperate hope. Temperance, despite appearing calm and compliant, was positioning herself between the scarred man and his escape route back to his horse. The mare might have one more surprise left in her, and Chase realized he had to trust that his $1 investment would pay its final dividend. Chase made his decision in the space between heartbeats. Instead of surrendering or running, he suddenly stood up and shouted Temperance's name at the top of his lungs. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The mare, who had seemed docile moments before, exploded into violent motion. She reared up on her hind legs and brought her hooves down on the scarred man's shoulder with bone-crushing force. His scream of agony cut through the air as he dropped both his weapon and the second metal box. Temperance didn't stop there. She spun and kicked backward with both hooves, catching the scarred man in the chest and sending him flying into the barn wall with a sickening crack. The box he'd been carrying skittered across the dirt, its contents spilling out in a shower of official-looking documents and what appeared to be survey maps. The tobacco-spitting rider tried to get a clear shot at the rampaging mare, but she was moving too fast and too unpredictably. Sheriff Keene cursed and raised his own weapon, but Chase was already moving. He sprinted toward the scattered papers, scooping up handfuls of documents even as bullets whined around him. The maps showed property boundaries, and the papers bore official seals and signatures that made Chase's blood run cold. These weren't just any documents. They were land grants, mineral rights, and territorial surveys that could rewrite the ownership of half the territory. Those papers belong to people far more dangerous than you can imagine, Sheriff Keene shouted, advancing with his gun trained on Chase's center mass. But Chase was already reading names and dates that explained everything. The documents proved that vast sections of land supposedly owned by territorial governors and railroad barons had actually been granted to native tribes and individual settlers years before. The mineral rights alone were worth millions, and the railroad contracts were based on fraudulent land claims. "This is what Malachi Brooks died for," Chase said, backing toward his house with the papers clutched against his chest. He found proof that half the territory's been stolen through forged documents and bribed officials. The scarred man was crawling away from Temperance, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle, but his eyes remained fixed on the scattered documents with desperate hunger. The tobacco-spitting rider had finally gotten a clear shot at the mare, but hesitated when he realized that killing her might spook his own horse. "You don't understand what you're holding," Sheriff Keene said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Those papers will start a war. Innocent people will die when the truth comes out." Chase felt the weight of the metal box still hidden in his jacket, and suddenly understood why someone had orchestrated such an elaborate scheme to get him to find these documents. Someone wanted the truth exposed, but they'd needed a fall guy to take the risk of discovery. "Maybe it's time for that war," Chase said, backing through his front door. "Maybe it's time people knew who really owns this land." But as he spoke, Chase heard the sound of more horses approaching at a gallop. Reinforcements were coming, and he realized that his small ranch was about to become the center of a battle that would determine the future of the entire territory. The $1 horse had led him to a treasure worth more than gold, but now he had to survive long enough to ensure the truth reached people who could act on it. Chase barricaded himself inside his house just as 6 more riders thundered into his yard. Through the cracked window, he could see they weren't lawmen or hired guns, but weathered ranchers and townspeople he recognized from the general store and church gatherings. At their head rode Judge Marcus Whitley, Marcus, an honest man whose reputation for fairness had made him enemies among the territory's corrupt elite. "Sheriff Keene," Judge Whitley's voice carried the authority of decades on the bench, "step away from that house and explain why you're conducting armed operations on private property without a warrant." Chase felt a surge of hope as he realized that the approaching reinforcements weren't coming to silence him, but to investigate the very corruption he'd stumbled upon. Someone had sent word to Judge Whitley about what was happening at his ranch, and the judge had brought armed citizens who wouldn't be easily intimidated. Sheriff Keene holstered his weapon, but kept his hand near the grip. "Judge Whitley, this man is in possession of stolen property and has assaulted a territorial officer in the performance of his duties." "That territorial officer," Chase shouted through the window, holding up the scattered documents, "is stealing land from legitimate owners and covering up fraud that goes all the way to the territorial capital." Judge Whitley dismounted and approached the house with measured steps. The other riders spread out in a semicircle, effectively surrounding Sheriff Keene and his injured companions. Chase noticed that several of the judge's men carried rifles and had the hard-eyed look of veterans who'd survived more than one range war. "Mr. Hawk," Judge Whitley called out, "I'm going to need you to come out here and explain what you've discovered. You have my word that you'll be protected while you present your evidence." Chase looked at the scarred man, who was now sitting against the barn wall clutching his broken arm and staring at Temperance with undisguised hatred. The tobacco-spitting rider had his hands raised and was slowly backing toward his horse, clearly calculating whether he could escape before the judge's men surrounded him completely. These documents prove that Governor Harrison and the Railroad Consortium have been using forged land grants to steal property from native tribes and individual settlers, Chase announced, stepping onto his porch with the papers held high. They show mineral rights worth millions being transferred through fraudulent sales and bribed officials. Judge Whitley's expression grew thunderous as Chase handed over the documents for examination. The judge's reputation for thorough investigation was legendary, and Chase could see him mentally cataloging evidence and identifying witnesses who would need to be questioned. "Sheriff Keene," Judge Whitley said after reviewing several of the papers, "you're hereby suspended from duty pending a full investigation into your involvement in this conspiracy. Surrender your badge and weapon immediately." But Sheriff Keene wasn't finished fighting. His hand moved toward his gun with desperate speed, and Chase realized that corrupt men with everything to lose were the most dangerous opponents of all. The next few seconds would determine whether justice would finally come to the territory or whether the powerful men behind the conspiracy would silence everyone who threatened their empire of stolen land and fraudulent claims. Sheriff Keene's hand had barely touched his weapon when 3 rifles swung in his direction. The judge's men were experienced and ready, and the corrupt sheriff found himself staring down multiple barrels before he could clear leather. "Don't make this worse than it already is," Judge Whitley warned, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You're already facing charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Drawing on a federal judge will add summary execution to that list." Sheriff Keene slowly raised his hands and allowed one of the armed citizens to remove his badge and weapons. The tobacco-spitting rider was similarly disarmed, while the scarred man remained slumped against the barn wall, too injured to pose further threat. Chase retrieved the second metal box from where it had fallen during Temperance's attack and handed it to Judge Whitley along with the scattered documents. The contents revealed not just the scope of the land fraud, but detailed records of bribes paid to territorial officials, forged signatures on government documents, and a systematic conspiracy to steal millions of acres from their rightful owners. "Mr. Hawk," Judge Whitley said after examining the evidence, "these documents will need to be authenticated and presented to federal authorities in the territorial capital. You'll be required to testify about how you discovered them and what threats were made against your life." Chase nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The $1 he'd spent on Temperance had purchased more than a worn-out mare. It had bought him a chance to expose corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial government. "What about the mare?" Chase asked, looking at Temperance, who stood calmly near the barn as though the violent confrontation had never happened. Judge Whitley smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "According to these documents, that mare belonged to Samuel Brooks, Malachi's younger brother, who was murdered 6 months ago when he tried to expose this same conspiracy. The horse legally belongs to his estate, which means she's yours by right of purchase from the estate's executor." Chase approached Temperance and gently stroked her neck, marveling at how the seemingly worthless animal had guided him to a discovery that would change the territory forever. She nuzzled his hand as though acknowledging their partnership in bringing justice to those who had thought themselves above the law. Over the following months, Chase testified before territorial and federal investigators, helping to convict dozens of corrupt officials and recover millions of acres of stolen land. The railroad consortium collapsed when their fraudulent land claims were exposed, and Governor Harrison fled to Mexico rather than face trial. Chase's own ranch was saved when grateful native tribes, whose stolen lands were returned through his testimony, gifted him clear title to his property, along with mineral rights that made him modestly wealthy. But he continued working the land with his own hands, finding satisfaction in honest labor that no amount of money could replace. Temperance lived out her remaining years in comfort, grazing in green pastures that Chase could now afford to maintain. Sometimes, watching her graze in the evening light, Chase would remember that desperate moment when he'd spent his last dollar on what everyone else saw as a worthless horse. That single dollar had taught him that the most valuable investments were often the ones that looked like foolish gambles to everyone else. Sometimes the broken-looking things really did carry the greatest treasures, and sometimes helping others was the surest path to helping yourself. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
A forgotten dog. Old bones, trembling legs, and eyes that once knew purpose. Tossed into an auction yard like broken furniture. No name, no bids, no hope. Until one man raised his hand. Not for glory, not for charity, but because he saw something no one else did. A flicker. A fight. A soul still worth saving. He was just a local cop with $90 in his wallet and more regrets than he cared to count. But what he did next would rewrite both their stories. This is not just about rescue. This is about redemption. This is about two broken lives choosing, quietly, fiercely, to rise again. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and ring the bell. Because stories like this, they remind us why we still believe. The late autumn sun hung low over Fort Laramie, Wyoming, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot of the Billings Livestock Pavilion. Dust swirled around boot heels, mingling with the scent of hay, manure, and engine oil. The air was sharp with the chill that hinted of winter. People crowded the arena stands in flannel shirts and worn jeans, their voices low, eyes calculating. It was auction day, not for antiques or artwork, but for livestock and forgotten animals. Daniel Reeds stood alone near the back wall, hands in the pockets of his faded sheriff's jacket. He was 35, tall, with a lean build hardened by years in uniform. His dark hair was cropped short, speckled with early gray at the temples. A faint scar traced the side of his jaw, souvenir from a raid gone sideways in Kansas City. His hazel eyes, though calm, carried a weariness that hadn't lifted since Hawk's final breath. Hawk, the black canine who had taken a bullet for him. After that night, Daniel didn't sleep right. Couldn't walk past his badge without hearing Hawk's last bark echo. Transferring to Fort Laramie had been less about career and more about survival. A new place, a quieter post, less noise, less pain. But pain had a way of finding its own shape. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the barn, deep and rhythmic like a preacher calling sinners to the altar. Next up, a male, golden retriever, approximate age, 12, no papers, no history, sold as is. 2 handlers led the dog in. His steps were uneven, the rear right leg dragging slightly in the dirt. His coat, once likely sun-bright gold, was faded and stained with time and mud. Patches of fur were missing along his flanks, and his ribs pressed visibly against skin. The dog didn't look around. He didn't bark. He simply stood, as if used to the weight of being ignored. A teenager in the front row whispered to his friend, "Looks like a ghost, not a dog." Another man muttered, "Ain't worth feedin'. Thing's half dead already." Daniel's gaze sharpened. The dog, no collar, no tag, lifted his head for a moment. Their eyes met, and for one suspended breath, Daniel felt like someone had just whispered Hawk's name through the dust. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "All right, folks, let's get started. We'll open at 10. $10. Any takers?" Silence. 10? 5? Come on, folks. Someone must need a guard dog, or a warm coat in winter. More chuckles. No bids. Someone yelled, "Bet it bites!" The auctioneer chuckled, tapping his gavel. "Looks like this one's going back." Daniel's voice didn't speak, but his hand rose. The motion was quiet, almost private. The auctioneer blinked. "Do I see a bid?" A pause. Then Daniel spoke clearly. $99. A hush swept the crowd. Not for the price, but for the strangeness of it. Who bids more than asked, on a dog like that? "Sold," the auctioneer said, more relieved than anything. The gavel cracked once and the dog's fate was rewritten. Daniel stepped forward. People stared. He didn't look at them, didn't offer an explanation. The older woman standing nearby, Sarah Mott, mid-60s, tall and angular in a long brown coat, squinted at Daniel as he passed. She had sharp cheekbones, gray-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, and eyes like chipped ice. Once the town librarian, Sarah had become something colder after losing her husband in a blizzard 5 winters ago. Since then, she had little warmth left for people or dogs. She muttered under her breath, "City boys and lost causes." The handlers handed Daniel a tattered leash. The dog didn't resist, but also didn't move. Daniel crouched, not pulling, not forcing. "Come on, old boy," he said gently. "Let's go." The dog stared at him for a moment, as if waiting for pain. Then, slowly, one paw moved. Then another. It wasn't grace, it was surrender. They walked out together. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered across the asphalt like whispers, and clouds were moving in from the north. The light was dull now, the sun caught in a shroud of gray. Daniel opened the passenger door of his department-issued SUV. The dog hesitated, then climbed in with effort. Daniel sat behind the wheel, took one last look at the auction yard through the windshield, and started the engine. His voice, barely above a murmur, "You're not Hawk, but you're something." The wind cut sharper by the time Daniel turned off the county road and onto the long gravel drive that led to his rented house. The sun was dipping low, dragging the clouds into colors of ash and rust. A worn wooden mailbox leaned to one side, the numbers 209 barely visible beneath peeling white paint. His boots crunched the frost-glazed gravel as he stepped out and opened the passenger door. The dog, still silent, didn't move at first. Daniel waited. No commands, no coaxing. Finally, Murphy shifted, his old bones groaning under his weight, and climbed down. The house wasn't much. Single-story, whitewashed siding, porch with a warped railing, and a tin roof that rattled in the wind. It backed onto a stretch of open land, half meadow, half pine. For Daniel, it was perfect. Quiet, isolated, a place where no one asked too many questions. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and the faint remnants of last night's coffee. Daniel had left the heat on low, but the chill still clung to the floorboards. He pointed toward the back room. "That's yours if you want it," he said, more to the silence than to Murphy. The dog stood in the doorway, gaze sweeping the room with tired caution. He didn't sniff, didn't wag. He moved slowly, settled in the farthest corner, and lay down without a sound. Daniel watched him for a long minute, then turned and went to the kitchen. He warmed up a can of chicken and rice, spooned it into a bowl, and set it just inside the threshold of the back room. Murphy didn't even lift his head. The man sighed, pulled off his jacket, and rubbed at his jaw. "Suit yourself," he muttered, and walked away. That night, the wind rattled the windows. Coyotes howled out beyond the fields. Daniel sat on the old couch in the living room, flipping through a local case file out of habit, but not reading a word. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the closed door down the hall. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the weight that dog carried, so visible even in stillness. At 2:13 a.m., Daniel awoke on the couch with a stiff neck and an aching shoulder. The fire had gone out, and the cold seeped in through every wall. He stood up, groggy, and went to check on Murphy. He opened the door quietly. The bowl of food was untouched. The dog still lay in the same position, though now his eyes were open, wide, and unblinking. Daniel stepped inside, crouched beside him. "Still breathing," he whispered, half to himself. Then it happened. Murphy moved his head, slow, deliberate, and rested it against Daniel's boot. Just a fraction of weight. Just enough. Daniel didn't move for a long time. Across the dirt path, the porch light at 221 flickered on. Clara Maynard, age 70, stood just behind the screen door. Tall and lean, she had the wiry frame of a woman who had done most things in life for herself. Her hair, a thin braid of silver, hung over one shoulder. She wore a navy cardigan with elbow patches, loose jeans, and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses that slid down her narrow nose every time she frowned, which was often. Clara had lived in Fort Laramie her whole life. Once the town's only veterinarian, she had closed her clinic after her husband, George, died in a tractor rollover on a foggy back road 4 years ago. Since then, she had kept to herself, spending mornings with a crossword, evenings with old radio plays, and every day with a telescope's focus on her bird feeders, or the people next door. She'd watched Daniel arrive a week ago, saw him unload a single duffel bag and a box of books, knew right away he wasn't married, and she didn't miss today's commotion when he returned with the battered golden retriever. Clara had seen enough neglected dogs in her life to recognize one that had been broken. Her fingers tightened around the mug of chamomile. "That dog won't eat," she murmured to herself. "Not yet." She flicked off the light but left the porch door unlatched, just in case. Morning came silver and brittle. Frost iced the edges of the windows, and the fields beyond glimmered in the early light. Daniel brewed a pot of coffee, black and bitter, the way he liked it. He poured a second mug and hesitated, then walked to the back room. The dog hadn't moved. The food still untouched. Daniel sat down on the wooden floor, back against the wall. He took a sip from one mug, then placed the other near the dog. "I don't know what they called you," he said quietly. "Maybe nothing. Doesn't matter. You're Murphy now. Old name, but I figure it suits you." No reaction, but the dog's ears flicked. "I had a partner once," Daniel continued, staring at the opposite wall. "Black Shepherd. Name was Hawk. He took a bullet for me in a parking garage, Just like that, no hesitation. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. After that, I stopped looking people in the eye. Figured I'd seen all the loyalty this world had to offer. Another pause, then he finished the coffee and stood. I'm not asking you to be him. Just be here. As he turned to leave, Murphy shifted. Not much, but his head lifted a little. His eyes followed Daniel to the door. Later that afternoon, Clara walked up the drive, wrapped in a wool shawl and clutching a basket of something warm and fragrant. Daniel met her on the porch, a little surprised. Morning. Barely, she said, brushing past him with the authority only age allows. You got a dog that won't eat? He blinked. Yeah. Thought so. I saw the leash, and the way you walked in last night like something might break if you stepped too hard. She placed the basket on the counter. Chicken liver and rice, mixed in bone broth and turmeric. Old recipe. Used to work for dogs who forgot what hunger felt like. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You're a vet? Was, she corrected. Still know a thing or two. Let me see him. He led her to the room. Murphy didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared. Clara knelt down, slow and deliberate. Well, aren't you something? She murmured. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small square of jerky, and placed it on the floor. Murphy didn't move. But 5 minutes later, after everyone had left, the jerky was gone. The morning broke pale and cold, a thin mist rolling across the hills beyond Daniel's porch. Frost painted every blade of grass in silver, and the low sun turned the horizon into something that almost resembled peace. Inside, the old wooden house was quiet, save for the soft clicking of claws on hardwood as Murphy limped down the hall. Daniel knelt by the tub, sleeves rolled up, a towel over one shoulder. He had filled it half with warm water, steam gently rising, carrying the scent of cedar soap. Come on, bud, he murmured, voice calm. Let's clean you up. Murphy hesitated in the doorway, his body stiff, eyes wary. Daniel didn't reach for him. He simply sat down beside the tub and waited. After a long, painful pause, the dog moved forward, inch by inch, until his front paws were inside the tub. Daniel gently lifted the rest of him in. The water turned brown quickly. Murphy didn't resist, but his muscles twitched under Daniel's hands with every touch. Daniel worked slowly, using soft strokes and low words. Beneath the grime, the dog's body was a roadmap of abuse. Near his right flank, the fur parted to reveal thin, circular scars. Burns. Older ones faded to pale pink. Newer ones, red and raw. Higher on his back, Daniel's fingers traced the faint pattern of what looked like wire indentations, places where fur no longer grew, twisted tight once, long ago. Daniel set down the sponge and sat back on his heels. What the hell did they do to you? He whispered. Murphy didn't look at him, but his head sank a little, resting on the edge of the tub. Later that afternoon, Daniel wrapped the dog in a thick towel and carried him to the passenger seat of his SUV. They drove into town, past the old grain silo, the shuttered diner, and the school football field where a few kids kicked a ball through frostbitten grass. The sign for the Fort Laramie Veterinary Clinic creaked in the breeze. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and dog biscuits. The walls were lined with photos of smiling pets and handwritten thank you notes from grateful families. Behind the front desk stood Dr. Martin Chase, mid-40s, medium build, clean-shaven with square glasses and a well-pressed flannel shirt tucked into neat khakis. Martin had a gentle demeanor and a voice so calm it could lull kittens to sleep. He used to work in Denver before returning to his hometown to take over his father's practice. He was known in Fort Laramie as dependable, kind, and perhaps a little too cautious. Martin approached with practiced eyes, glancing at the dog before looking up at Daniel. You must be the new deputy. Heard about the auction. Daniel nodded. This is Murphy. Martin led them to the back room. The metal exam table gleamed under bright lights. Murphy trembled slightly as he was lifted, but made no sound. Martin ran his hands gently along Murphy's ribs, pausing at the scars. He frowned, expression shifting. These weren't from fights or fences, he said. These were placed intentionally. Heat burns, probably shock or acid-based, and here, see this, twisted wire or cable, possibly restraint. This wasn't a one-time thing. Daniel's jaw tightened. Whoever had him before, Martin added, they weren't keeping a pet. They were breaking something. Daniel looked at Murphy, who met his gaze for just a second, amber eyes steady despite everything. He didn't break. At the Fort Laramie police station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniel stepped through the main entrance. The building was modest. 3 desks, a radio room, a break corner with burnt coffee and a vending machine that never worked right. Chief Wesley Hart, mid-50s, tall with graying blonde hair and a beer belly he tried to hide under his belt, looked up from his desk. Wesley had spent 30 years in Fort Laramie, most of it with his boots on the desk and one eye on the door. He was a man who didn't trust fast talkers, outside change, or officers with too much soul-searching in their eyes. "Thought you were still settling in," Wesley said, arms crossed. "You volunteering for duty now?" Daniel set a manila folder on the desk. "Just getting up to speed." Wesley stared at him a long moment. "You bringing more than baggage with you, Reeds?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Just what I need." Across the room, a soft chuckle cut through the tension. Officer Erin McKay, early 30s, short, dark red hair pulled into a bun under her cap, leaned back in her chair with a half-finished donut in hand. She had a scar over her right brow, a crooked grin, and a reputation for having sharper instincts than most men on the force. Erin had grown up in nearby Casper and returned to Fort Laramie after a failed marriage and too many nights in a Denver patrol car. She tilted her head. "That the mutt from the auction?" Daniel nodded. "Thought no one had touched him," she said. "You got a thing for lost causes?" Daniel offered a small, humorless smile. "Maybe." She tapped her pen on the desk. "Well, he's lucky. You could have picked a fight at a gas station instead. Lot fewer vet bills." Despite the joke, her eyes lingered on him longer than the words did. There was curiosity there, maybe even concern, or recognition of something familiar. As Daniel turned to leave, Erin called out, "Hey, Reeds." He stopped. "If that dog ends up needing a place to run, there's an open field behind my parents' old farm. Fenced in. No neighbors." Daniel nodded once. "Thanks." That night, back at the house, Murphy lay near the hearth, a flannel blanket wrapped beneath him. Daniel sat on the floor, drinking tea Clara had left earlier. Outside, wind scratched the windows, but inside, it was warm. For the first time since arriving in Fort Laramie, Daniel didn't feel like he was just passing through. It started with a siren. Not a loud one, not even close. Just the quick wail of a patrol car passing down County Road 9, maybe half a mile away. Daniel barely noticed it from his porch, sipping coffee, watching frost melt from the railing. But Murphy did. The old Golden's body snapped upright like a cord had been pulled. His breathing shifted, shallow and sharp. His eyes fixed on the distant sound, wide and unblinking, his whole frame trembling. By the time Daniel turned toward him, Murphy was backing toward the screen door, tail tucked, chest heaving in short bursts. "Hey," Daniel said softly, setting his mug down. "It's just a car. Nothing's coming." But Murphy didn't hear that. Or if he did, it was buried beneath something deeper, something remembered. Daniel crouched low, offering a flat palm, unmoving. After a full minute, Murphy lowered himself to the porch floor, chin down, but his eyes stayed fixed in that direction. The air between them hung heavy. Later that day, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a half-drunk cup of black coffee growing cold beside it. A sticky note was taped to the side of the screen with a handwritten code. Murphy 93 RF, Micro ID. Dr. Chase had found the microchip during a routine scan 2 days earlier and handed Daniel the number without much hope. "Sometimes they don't register anything at all," he had said. But Daniel was stubborn. He pulled up the National Pet Recovery Database and punched in the ID. A green bar loaded, then a match. Registered to Blackstone K9 Training Facility, Larimer County, CO. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He clicked through to a history log. Status, facility closed. Reason, multiple animal welfare violations. His stomach turned. He reached for his phone and hesitated, then called the station. Erin answered on the second ring. Her voice came through steady and dry. "McKay." "It's Reed's. You busy?" There was a pause. "Define busy." "I need help tracing something, dog-related. You still got that state login for facility reports?" She sighed. "You buying lunch?" "I'll throw in coffee." 10 minutes. At the station, Erin leaned over Daniel's laptop, hair tied up, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her freckles were more noticeable in the afternoon sun pouring through the blinds. She tapped rapidly, flipping between search windows. "Blackstone K9, she muttered. "I remember this place. Made a splash a few years back. Private security contract for warehouse firms. Claimed to retrain aggressive dogs for asset protection. Real military-style stuff. Then someone leaked footage of dogs being shocked in metal pens." Daniel clenched his jaw, and Murphy was one of them. Erin nodded slowly, scrolling. Chip record puts him there 3 years ago. No owner name listed, just intake under priority mail category. That usually means high potential, high aggression, or high damage, Daniel finished. Erin glanced over at him. "You said he panicked when he heard a siren?" "Yeah. And when I wore my duty belt yesterday, he wouldn't come near me. He was okay until the flashlight clicked on." Erin's brows furrowed. "Sounds like he was conditioned to associate uniform gear with punishment." Daniel's voice was low. "They didn't just train him. They broke him." A silence stretched between them, heavy but not empty. Erin sat back, arms crossed. "You want the full report? I can pull the court filings. Might even find who ran the place before it went down." Daniel gave a short nod. "I want to know who did this." She looked at him for a long beat, then clicked open a new tab. That evening, Murphy lay curled on the living room rug, one eye half open, always watching. Daniel sat on the floor nearby, his jacket off, badge tucked away, nothing that made him look official. He held out an old tennis ball, scuffed and frayed. "Nothing fancy, just a game." Murphy didn't move. Daniel rolled the ball across the floor. It tapped the baseboard and bounced back. Still no movement. Then Daniel did something strange. He rolled onto his back on the floor, arms splayed, ball resting beside his head. Murphy blinked, sat up. After a moment, the dog limped forward, 3 tentative steps, and nudged the ball with his nose. Daniel smiled, not moving. "Attaboy." Back across the street, Clara stood in her dim kitchen, slicing carrots for stew. Her radio crackled with a country tune from the 60s. She moved with the grace of habit, not urgency, her body still sharp despite her age. She paused mid-slice, glanced out of the window. The lights in Daniel's house were on. She could just make out the silhouette of the man sitting on the floor, the dog near him. She smiled faintly. George would have liked that dog, she thought. George, her husband, had always believed some animals carried souls wiser than humans, especially the ones that had seen war. She turned off the radio and set the pot to boil. Maybe tomorrow she'd bring over some liver biscuits. The 2-lane road stretching south toward Colorado was flanked by barren cottonwoods and dry fences leaning with age. Frost clung to the shoulders of the asphalt, and the Rocky Mountains loomed faint in the distance like sleeping giants. Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel, his eyes set straight ahead, jaw locked, and Murphy curled quietly on the passenger seat wrapped in a faded blue blanket. The old Golden's breath fogged the window as he watched the trees pass. They crossed into Colorado by noon, the air colder and thinner than it had been in Fort Laramie. Daniel had called in a personal day. No questions were asked. He didn't offer reasons, and the GPS guided him through Loveland, then into the outskirts of Larimer County where Blackstone K9 had once operated. The property now sat fenced and padlocked, a rust-stained sign still hanging loosely on the gate. No trespassing. Closed by court order. Daniel stepped out, boots crunching dead leaves, and scanned the perimeter. Behind the broken fence, the facility sprawled in silent disrepair. corrugated metal buildings sagging under neglect, overgrown grass swallowing the old training yards. He walked the line, eyes catching traces of what it had once been. Agility ramps rotting in the field, kennel doors swinging with the wind, and faded signs with words like control and obey peeling into obscurity. He pulled out a notebook from his coat and began jotting details. The gate had a lock, but the side door of the main office hung open. Daniel hesitated, then stepped through. Inside, the air was thick with mold and rodent musk. Folders were scattered across the floor, torn papers curling with time. It took an hour of digging, but finally, tucked inside a rusted filing cabinet under the Discharge tab, he found a page. Owner Release Form. Murphy, male, golden retriever, transferred from Tolman Holdings, LLC. Daniel read the name twice. Greg Tolman. The form had no address, no phone number, just the name and a faded signature at the bottom. He folded the document, placed it in his jacket, and stepped back into the cold. Back in Fort Laramie, the afternoon sun hung low. Clara was in her garden, wrapped in a thick shawl and pruning the last of her rosemary bushes. Her hands were long-fingered, roughened by work and winter, and her face carried the deep-lined beauty of someone who had survived more than one kind of storm. When she saw Daniel's truck pull into the driveway, she stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "You've been somewhere," she said as he stepped out, eyes narrowing. "Colorado," Daniel replied, pulling the blanket-wrapped Murphy gently from the passenger seat. "Found something." Clara gestured him toward the porch. "Set him there. He looks sore." "He is," Daniel said, settling Murphy down. Clara returned moments later with a small wooden bowl filled with a thick paste. The smell was sharp, pine, vinegar, and something herbal. "What's that?" "Comfrey, turmeric, bit of white willow bark. My husband used it on his hound's joints when the weather turned. It won't cure everything, but it'll ease the ache." She knelt beside Murphy with a patience born of years. The dog didn't flinch when she touched him. Her fingers moved gently over his hips, massaging the balm into stiff joints. "You were a vet?" Daniel asked, crouching beside her. "For 32 years. George and I ran a clinic in town. Lost him in 19. After that, I didn't have it in me to keep fixing things." Daniel nodded. "I get that." She looked at him, one brow arching. "You're fixing something now, Deputy." Daniel looked away. "Trying." She smiled, rare and soft. "Then don't try alone." She handed him the rest of the balm. "Rub it in at night. Tell him he's safe. They hear more than we think." That evening, as snow began to fall in light flurries over Fort Laramie, Daniel sat at the table with Clara's paste beside him and the release form unfolded in front. The name, Greg Tolman, burned on the page. He ran a search through the Wyoming law enforcement database, and the first match sent a chill up his spine. Tolman had previous investigations in 3 counties: unlicensed animal trade, false papers for working dogs, and suspected connections to black market animal testing, though nothing had ever stuck. Daniel stared at Murphy asleep by the fireplace. The dog's legs twitched as if caught in a dream he couldn't outrun. Daniel whispered, "We'll find him." The wind howled through the cracks in Daniel's window that night, drawing long fingers of cold across the wooden floor. Inside, the fireplace threw orange light across the room, painting Murphy's golden fur in the warm tones that didn't quite reach his eyes. He lay curled near the hearth, still but not sleeping, his body taut, ears twitching to every creak and distant rustle. Daniel sat on the couch, flipping through notes and folders spread across the coffee table. His laptop was open, audio files lined up in a folder titled Blackstone Interviews. Clara had dropped off a thermos of mulled tea earlier, and it steamed gently on the armrest, untouched. He clicked on the third file, a recorded call between an informant and a former Blackstone trainer. The voice came through low and gravelly. "Greg doesn't show up much, but when he does, dogs start going quiet, like they know he's watching." Murphy shot upright. His whole body snapped rigid. Daniel froze. The voice on the recording continued. "He always wore the same jacket, smelled like fuel and metal. You could tell which dogs he'd worked with. They didn't look you in the eye anymore. Murphy let out a choked guttural whine and stumbled sideways. His legs gave out and he collapsed onto the rug, sides heaving. Daniel dropped the laptop and was on his knees in an instant. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe. You're here." Murphy's eyes were wild with confusion, breath rapid and shallow, tongue flicking in panic. His heart pounded so hard Daniel could feel it beneath his palm. The old dog's body shook as if caught in some memory the fire couldn't melt. Daniel reached for the remote and paused the recording. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound. It took several minutes for Murphy to calm. His body eventually curled in tighter, ears still low, tail tucked close, but his eyes never left the dark hallway. Daniel sat beside him, stroking his shoulder gently. "You remember his voice, don't you? That was him." Later, after Murphy had drifted into a trembling sleep, Daniel replayed the audio, this time with headphones. He isolated the voice, clipped a 10-second segment, and saved it under one name. Greg Tolman. Confirmed trigger. The next morning, a fresh snow dusted the porch railings and muffled every sound. The world looked clean again. Quiet. Daniel walked into the station with his coat still damp at the cuffs and a USB in his pocket. Erin was already there, leaning over a printer with a pen stuck behind her ear. She wore a black windbreaker, her cheeks slightly flushed, hair pulled back beneath a knit beanie. "Morning," she greeted, not looking up. "I need your help." She straightened. "Something new?" Daniel handed her the USB. "Murphy collapsed last night. He reacted to this voice, Tolman's. I need it documented." Erin plugged it in and played the clip, lips tightening as the voice crackled through her desktop speakers. "You think it's enough?" "It's evidence. Behavioral response to a known subject. Combined with the ownership record from Blackstone, it builds a pattern." She eyed him. "You ready to go federal with this?" Daniel hesitated. "You still have contacts with the Denver FBI field office?" "One, a supervisory agent named Keller. He's gruff, hates paperwork, but he's a good guy. He worked on animal trafficking cases 3 years ago." Daniel nodded slowly. "Let's talk to him." Erin reached for the phone, her tone shifting as she punched in numbers. Professional, but with that underlying conviction that Daniel was beginning to understand wasn't just for show. Erin McKay didn't fight for things that didn't matter. While she spoke, Daniel stared out the frosted window. Across the street, Clara was setting out small bowls of seeds on her porch railing. Finches flitted between her fingers and the trees, the smallest lives finding shelter in a season meant for endurance. By mid-afternoon, Erin had scheduled a remote consultation with Agent Keller for the next day. She also began assembling a list of attendees from the Fort Laramie auction, pulling in bid logs, license plate scans, and cell tower pings from that date. Daniel reviewed the documents with a slow-burning sense of purpose. He was no longer just a man trying to fix the past. Now he had names, evidence, a direction. As he packed his notes back into a folder, Erin glanced over. "You think he knows?" "Tolman?" She nodded. Daniel shrugged. "If he doesn't yet, he will soon." That evening, Murphy ate a full bowl of soft chicken and rice without being coaxed. He even nosed the empty bowl toward Daniel's foot afterward. Clara arrived just before sundown with more balm and a small jar of lavender oil. "This helps with sleep," she explained, placing it by the hearth. Daniel offered her a chair and a mug of the tea she'd brought the day before. They sat in silence for a while, then Clara spoke. "The ones that survive. They always carry the story, in their eyes, in the way they flinch when nothing's coming." Daniel looked at Murphy, who had laid his head on Daniel's boot again. "I think he's starting to believe he's not alone anymore," Daniel said. Clara gave a quiet nod. "Then you're doing it right." Snow had fallen heavy the night before, blanketing Fort Laramie in a white hush. The world seemed stiller somehow, as if waiting for something to shift. Daniel stood at the edge of his driveway, gloved hands deep in his pockets, watching Murphy nose through a patch of snow near the steps. The old dog moved slow, but with more steadiness than before. His breaths puffed visibly in the cold, and his tail, though low, occasionally gave a lazy wag. Inside the house, Clara sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, her fingers running along the edges of a weathered leather-bound journal. She didn't speak as Daniel entered. She simply looked up, eyes soft behind her reading glasses, and slid the book across the table toward him. "I found this in George's old toolbox," she said. "He kept records of every dog he treated that went on to save a life. House fires, search and rescue, even one that dragged a kid out of a frozen lake." Daniel opened the journal. Each page was handwritten, names in block letters followed by short-clipped notes. Luna, pulled grandmother from barn fire, 2003. Scout, avalanche rescue, Jackson Hole, 2011. At the bottom of the last page, Clara had penciled in a new line and left it blank. "He would have added Murphy," she said, standing. "I figured you should be the one to do it." Daniel stared at the empty line, heart tight in his chest. Then, with slow care, he picked up the pen and wrote, "Murphy, survivor, witness, protector." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now go finish it." By late morning, Daniel and Aaron were headed toward the Denver FBI field office, snow chains clinking softly under the tires of Aaron's government-issued SUV. Aaron drove with her usual no-nonsense air, eyes flicking between the road and the file folder in her lap. She wore a black winter coat with the Fort Laramie badge stitched over the left pocket, her copper hair braided down one shoulder. Her expression was calm, but there was tension behind her jaw. "You ready for this?" she asked without looking at him. Daniel nodded. "We've got the chip record, the behavior footage, the auction logs, and the voice trigger file. And the transfer record from Tolman Holdings," she added. "This isn't just circumstantial anymore." The Denver office was a glass and brick building tucked between government housing and a UPS distribution center. Inside, the halls were quiet and clinical, echoing with the occasional shuffle of dress shoes and murmured conversation. They were met by Agent Mark Keller, mid-50s, ex-Marine with squared shoulders, cropped gray hair, and a voice that always sounded like gravel under boot heels. He had a steel, prosthetic finger on his left hand and a reputation for being impossible to intimidate. Keller reviewed the evidence slowly, flipping through pages, listening to the audio, and watching the short video clips Daniel had recorded of Murphy reacting to Greg Tolman's voice. His expression remained unreadable until the end. When he finally closed the folder, he let out a breath. "You two did your homework. So, will you move on it?" Aaron asked. Keller leaned back, laced his fingers, and nodded once. "We've had eyes on Tolman for years. Never had a clean enough link between him and the illegal sales. Until now." Daniel met his gaze. "What's the play?" "Already in motion. We'll move tonight. Quiet takedown. You'll be updated once it's done." That evening, as the first stars pushed through the frost-lined clouds, Daniel stood by his front porch, phone buzzing softly in his hand. On the other end, Agent Keller's voice came through. "He's in custody. No injuries. We recovered 2 dogs from the property, both alive, though barely. Looks like he was prepping them for sale." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight lift slowly from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. "You gave us what we needed," Keller replied. "Sometimes justice takes the long road, but it gets there." The next day, Daniel walked into the sheriff's office and placed a signed request for indefinite leave on Chief Hart's desk. Hart looked up, chewing the end of a pencil. "Leaving town?" "Building something," Daniel replied. Hart studied him a moment, then nodded. "Just don't forget to send a postcard." 2 weeks later, in the quiet hills of central Montana, Daniel stood in the middle of a freshly fenced plot of land. The wind rolled gently across the pine trees, carrying the scent of cedar and thawing earth. Clara was kneeling by the porch of a small, newly built cabin, planting lavender in neat rows. Murphy wandered nearby. No leash, his nose dusted with dirt, ears perked at every bird call. The Whisper Pines Canine Sanctuary was no longer just an idea. It was wood and stone, wire fence, and water troughs. 5 kennels sat under a covered awning, each one warm and waiting. The place didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a second chance. Clara stood, wiped her hands, and watched Murphy explore. "You think he knows?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. I think he's always known. He pulled the journal from his coat pocket and set it on the porch. The wind flipped it open to the last page. And for the first time in years, Daniel Reeds smiled without regret. The sky above Montana stretched wide and clean, painted in soft hues of early spring. The snow had melted in patches, leaving behind a tender green that pushed through the soil like hope reborn. The air was still cool, but it carried a gentleness now, less bite, more breath. Murphy stepped forward, one slow paw after another, across the soft grass that lined the eastern edge of the new sanctuary. The gate behind him creaked as it closed, not with finality, but with peace. There were no chains here, no cement pens, just open land, the smell of pine, and the golden wash of morning sunlight. His coat, though still patchy in places, had regained much of its sheen. His limbs moved with effort, but no longer with pain. Every breath he drew seemed easier, less guarded, like a soldier laying down his armor. Daniel sat on the front steps of the cabin, arms resting over his knees, a cup of black coffee steaming between his palms. His hair had grown out slightly, the grays at his temples more visible now in the sun. He wore a flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, boots worn but polished. His face, once locked in quiet grief, had softened in the past few weeks, creased now by purpose, not regret. From the hill above the kennels, Clara emerged carrying a basket of towels, her gait slow but steady. Her silver braid caught the light as she walked, and behind her, 3 new arrivals nosed their way cautiously through the yard. A wiry border collie missing one eye, a stocky pit bull with scars across his ribs, and a young mutt with nervous energy but eyes that still dared to trust. Murphy turned his head toward the newcomers and then back to Daniel. There was no fear, no hesitation, just quiet acceptance, as if he'd always known he'd be first and never expected to be the last. Daniel stood, stretched, and stepped off the porch to meet him. "You're not a project anymore," he said softly, crouching beside Murphy. "You're the welcome committee." From the dirt road beyond the gate, the sound of tires on gravel whispered through the air. Daniel looked up, squinting into the light. A dark green pickup rolled to a slow stop near the split-rail fence. The door opened, and Erin McKay stepped out. She wore jeans, hiking boots, and a soft gray hoodie under her deputy's field jacket, her badge now clipped to her belt instead of pinned. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her expression was lighter than it had been in weeks. "Thought I'd drop off those first aid kits you ordered," she called out, holding up a cardboard box. Daniel smiled. "Sure, you're not just here to visit your favorite dog?" Erin leaned on the fence, her eyes falling on Murphy, who had padded over and was now sniffing her boots with cautious interest. "I could be here for the mutt," she said, "but the coffee's better than anything back at the outpost." She walked through the gate without waiting for permission and sat beside Daniel on the porch steps. "How's the town treating you?" he asked. She shrugged. "Quiet enough. Sheriff's office out in Carter County is half empty, which means I get to build things my way for a change. Still, I miss having someone to argue with over case files." Daniel chuckled. "Give it time. You'll be arguing with Clara about biscuit recipes before long." Across the yard, Clara was gently brushing the pit bull with a curry comb, humming a melody from some old radio tune. She looked up just long enough to give Erin a nod, then returned to her task. Erin looked around the property, the cabin, the kennels, the dogs sunbathing in the grass, and let out a breath. "It's good here." Daniel nodded. "It's a start." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Murphy lay beside them, head resting on Daniel's boot, his breathing slow and steady. The other dogs roamed in small circles, exploring with the cautious joy of those who had once been hurt but had not forgotten how to heal. Erin finally spoke. "You ever think about expanding?" "I'm already thinking about the next fence line," Daniel said, "and Clara's working on plans for a therapy space inside the barn. Might even build a trail through the woods." Erin leaned back on her palms. "Let me know if you ever need help." Daniel turned toward her, just enough to catch her eyes. "You already are." Murphy stirred at his feet, rolled onto his side, and gave a small huff of contentment. It was not a bark, Not a cry, just the sound of a soul at ease. Daniel glanced down and whispered, "You're home now." And for the first time, the dog didn't flinch. We don't choose where our story begins, but we can choose who walks beside us as it continues. Murphy was just one dog. Broken, forgotten, discarded like so many others. But in finding a new home, he did more than survive. He lit a path. He stirred the ashes of memory, connected strangers, and reminded us that even what's been wounded can still be worthy of love. A dog without a name became a guardian of second chances, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Maybe in our own lives, we pass by the Murphys of the world without seeing. Maybe healing starts when we simply stop and choose to care. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can echo louder than we imagine. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear how animals have touched your life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of healing and redemption. And may God bless each of you watching. May you always find light, even in forgotten places.